Welcome back to Heart Breathings. Today is probably the most anticipated video of Preptober this year, which is how to outline your book. So I am so excited about this because I love outlining. It's one of my favorite parts of the writing process, and I can't wait to talk you through my process and give you some tools that might help you with your own book. So let's get started. I am joining you today with some hot tea because I have caught a little bit of a funk from my 4-year-old daughter. So I am a little bit lower energy today, but thankfully this topic gives me some energy. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to give you a little bit of a pep talk, and then I'm going to show you top down how I would outline it. I'm going to walk you through a process that you could also use. But I want you to keep in mind that outlining and how much of it you need to do, or whether you need to do any of it at all, is a choice, and it's fully your preference. And we all have different strengths and weaknesses. We all have a different process when it comes to writing. So what I encourage you to do when you're thinking about this type of process of outlining and everything else is to pay attention to what feels good to you. Because sometimes you might see someone else doing something and you think, oh, I need to do it that way. That's how writers do it. But then when you start doing it, it doesn't really work for you. And then when you actually go to start writing, you're thinking, I didn't even use any of that outlining. I wish I had just jumped in and had fun with just discovering the story as I go. So one big tip is to give yourself permission to just let your process be what works naturally for you, because you're going to be the expert and the guru of your own process, and everything else is just a tool that you can pull out of a toolbox. So I'm going to give you some tools today that you might be able to use. Take what works for you and just let go of everything else. So now comes the pep talk. When it comes to outlining your story or getting ready for something like NaNoWriMo or starting a new book, sometimes what holds us back is this feeling of overwhelm, because we're standing at the beginning of what feels like a giant mountain that we need to climb, and we're thinking, I don't know how to get from here to there, and it can feel very overwhelming. So my encouragement to you is to take a step back from that overwhelm and instead realize that you're going to get through this step by step. Nobody just sits down and snaps their fingers and immediately knows the plot and the process or the steps they're going to follow from beginning to end. We are all going through. That's why they call it a craft. That's why we call it a writing process, is because we're all going through steps to get where we want to go. So let me give you an example. I live in the Dallas, Texas area. If I wanted to drive to New York City, I could get in my car, and without any tools or any idea of what to do, it would feel pretty overwhelming, because I'm like, I think I just need to go kind of like northeast, but I don't know how far north. I don't know the best path through. I don't want to waste time. I don't want to end up in a place that's unsafe. But if I focused on how big of a journey this is, it could feel really, really overwhelming. However, once I start to realize that I have tools at my disposal, I have, internet and GPS, and I have maps and other things that I can use. Now I know, and I can have faith at the beginning of the journey that even though I don't know every step along the way, every turn, every place I'm going to stop for dinner, or all of those details, I can feel confident that I'm going to get to New York City as long as I keep turning to those tools and taking it one turn at a time, one decision at a time. Everything's going to work out. I want you to approach the beginning of writing your novel in this same way, having faith that as long as you stick with it and you use the tools that you pull out of different toolboxes that we have as writers, and you continue to take it one step, one turn, one decision in your story at a time, you know that you will eventually get to that novel. So take a step back from the pressure of, I have to have it all figured out, and this has to someday become a novel that's going to be good enough to sell or to read or to make me, a best-selling author. Take that pressure out of it here at the beginning of the process. Use what gives you energy and excitement, like, oh, this is my first book. This is so exciting. Or, oh my gosh, I get to write this next book in the series. Use the things that give you energy, but try to let go of the things that make you feel overwhelmed or that at all make you feel like you can't do it. Because I promise you, the same way that you could get into your car right now and get to New York City, taking it one turn at a time, you can sit down and figure out this plot and the outline, and step by step in your manuscript and in your plotting tools, you will figure this out. I have complete faith in you. But sometimes it can just hold us back to have that eagle eye view of like, oh my gosh, I have so much I have to figure out. So take that pressure off yourself, and let's talk about some ways that you can actually sit down and plot this out. Okay, brainstorming and outlining. This is some of my favorite part of the writing process, and this is where a lot of the ideas start to flow. And I love using lots of colorful tools, washi tape, different colors of Post-its and page flags and things like that. But of course, none of this is necessary. It's just the process that's important. So you could do this in Scrivener or Google Docs or on a piece of paper with just a plain black pen. Like, none of that type stuff matters. It just matters how you're getting your ideas onto paper. But when I start outlining, I usually come to the table with already an idea of who my main character is and what this story is about in terms of the premise of the story. I know the setup of it and the main conflict that's going to happen. So is this a romance? Like, I know the genre, and then I have an idea of like the journey that we're about to go on to a degree. So with the disappearance of Vanessa Shaw that I'm currently wrapping up, hopefully fingers crossed before Nano, I knew going into it that the premise was going to be a group of teenagers get together 1 year after the disappearance of their friend to celebrate her life, and they get trapped there potentially with her killer. So that is the premise of the story. It's a murder mystery in terms of genre, and it has some potentially supernatural elements to it. And that might be all I know coming into it, but I at least have an idea of the genre of the story and the basics of the setup of the story. If you don't know that, then you might benefit more from stopping this video right now or just watching it through and then coming back to watch my previous Preptober videos about how to brainstorm an idea and think of your idea for your book. And that also walks you through how to choose which one is the right one for you. And then also my most recent one on world building and setting, where I give you a worksheet that you can work through on Google Docs to go ahead and start thinking and brainstorming descriptions and setting and a little bit about your world in terms of population and what locations this is in, what time this is in, especially if you're writing in a genre where you know you're going to have to do a lot of world building. You might want to go through that video and that worksheet a little bit before you come to the outline. But in some ways, you could also just start here and reverse engineer your world building after you're done. But I'm going to assume right now that you are coming to this video with already an idea of who your main character is and what's the premise or basic setup or conflict in this book. And here's where I like to start, is I will start with the big picture items. So for me, I tend to call this, I've always called this a 3-act structure because that's how I learned it, but there are 4 parts. And you know what? Recently I was just like, I'm just going to start calling this 4-act structure or 4-part structure. But in the past, I've always said Act 1, Act 2, Part 1, Act 2, Part 2, and Act 3, because that's the way I learned it. But I'm just kind of letting that go because I get tired of distinguishing between the Act 2 before the midpoint and after. So I'm just going to call this 4 parts, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And my story will be pretty evenly distributed between these 4 parts, except for Part 4 is usually the shortest part here. And so I have down here at the bottom, I have the Act 1 climax. This is also often called the doorway of no return, the first doorway. Then down here in Act 2, we have what's called the midpoint of the novel. Then we have the second doorway at the end of Part 3. And then over here, we have the climax and resolution of the entire story. So just understanding those broad strokes of the story. So here we also have the opening or hook, and then we have the climax, the Act 1 climax or the first doorway. I'll put them both here. This is always how I start, is I think about what do I see in my head? What do I know so far about this story that I could fill in these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to 6 basic broad strokes. So I can do it here on an index card. I could do it on a piece of paper or whatever, but I would start to just brainstorm what is possible that could happen in these slots. the easiest part for me to start with usually is what's the opening or hook of the story. So for something like this new story, the Mirror, Mirror of Shadows that I'm going to be working on for NaNoWriMo, the opening hook is likely to be something where we see my main character stealing something. So she's a magical thief, she's a witch, and part of the story is going to be her being a thief for the Order of Shadows. And so we'll probably see her stealing something, because the hook of the story, the opening scene of the story, ideally is going to be something that hooks your reader in. It doesn't have to be high action, but it needs to be something sort of genre specific that makes your reader interested to read more. It hooks them in, it gets them interested in your story world, your characters, or the romance, or whatever it is about your story. So since Disappearance of Vanessa Shaw, for example, is a murder mystery, the first scene in my book is the moment Vanessa disappears. And so that leaves us on a hook of like, oh my gosh, what really just happened to her? So coming up with a hook for a scene, I may not know anything more at the beginning of this brainstorming process than what if I have an opening scene where she steals something? And as I go through this brainstorming process to start outlining, I don't get too attached to any specific idea. So if this ends up not being the thing, no big deal. I'll just start a new note card, or I could write this in pencil or just put it in a document so I can easily erase and type over it. So don't get too attached to every idea. Don't get stuck in the feeling that it has to be the perfect idea the first way through. We're just following a process of trial and error, brainstorm, get it out there, see how it feels, move things around. So let's say I know she's stealing something, but the premise of this story is that in the process of doing her job for the Order of Shadows, she has a rival person who pushes her through a mirror. And in that mirror, she's stuck, similar to like an Alice in Wonderland sort of portal, or Narnia or something like that. She gets stuck in this shadow world, in this mirror world. And so for me, that is a natural Act 1 climax, the first doorway, because it's a literal doorway into a new world. So I would come over here and I would say she's pushed through the mirror. And my notes are going to be really sporadic here because I'm trying to do them quickly for the video. But so we start with her stealing something. At the end of Act 1, she gets pushed through the mirror. So then I can also go ahead and kind of fill in something here that we have the introduction to the new world, right? Like her reaction to it. What does it look like? Description of it. Who are the people in it? So I could go ahead and start brainstorming the world building parts of it here. Description, world building, what's her reaction? Who are the people here? So I could make those notes because I know all of that's going to happen in this first part of the second act. But then I'm going to skip ahead and say, okay, then what happens at the midpoint? The midpoint of a book is typically the this changes everything moment. It could be the moment when your characters first realize, oh my gosh, I'm actually falling for this girl. It could be sex, that these characters have sex for the first time. It could be, it doesn't have to be, obviously, it just can be genre dependent. It could be that we find a second body. If it's a murder mystery, now there's another body and it was one of our prime suspects. It could be that, like, if she's here in this mirror world, what could be the midpoint here? So maybe at the midpoint, she is challenged to a duel to the death. So we know that this is a dangerous world, right? So now I could come and say, well, maybe let's say this is a dangerous world and she's got to fight for her life. And then at the midpoint, she's challenged to a duel and she has to fight for her life. And this changes everything because she is now going to be put in danger. But then, you know, we'll see if that is what sticks or not. We're just putting out ideas and seeing how it goes. Then we're going to have a second doorway where there's going to be another thing that shifts. New information comes to light, a new battle. They try to make a new plan and make their final stand, you know, whatever it is. Second doorway, sometimes in a romance, is that something happens between this couple and new information comes to light and they break up, or they have to have like a black moment kind of thing where it's like they're not going to be able to be together. Something else happens in the story that breaks them up or pulls them apart in some way. So then we also have the climax and the resolution. So what happens at the end of this story? So she's stealing something, she gets pushed into this mirror world. What could happen at the end of the story? With a murder mystery like Disappearance of Vanessa Shaw, there's a genre expectation of what happens at the end of this story. With romance, there's a genre expectation that they're going to get together. With my Shadow Demon saga, there's an expectation in my series that it's going to end whatever the main conflict was of this particular book, but then there will also, inside the resolution, be a new problem presented, which is why my fans call them Sarah hangers, because it'll be like, oh, it's all wrapped up. Oh no, it isn't. The world has now fallen apart again. So what is the genre expectation of how your story will end, and what can you go ahead and brainstorm that might possibly happen in this story? So I have not actually had any time to plot my Mirror of Shadows. So this is just all coming off the top of my head real time, but I can see her getting pushed in the mirror, potentially going through a lot of trials and tribulations in this mirror world. But to create a good climax of the story, I would love to have her, free from the mirror. So somehow a battle or some kind of struggle that sets her free from the mirror. And then the resolution is, what is her life like after that, right? I already have some ideas, but I don't want to put spoilers in there of like my little touch of the next story coming in here. Once you have at least a few little things on this big picture level of opening, midpoint, doorway, write down any other ideas of things that you know you want to happen in the story. So for me, I might take another note card and just write brainstorm or something on it, or you could just do this anywhere. And I'm going to say, what else besides these moments do I think would be good for this story? Like, is there a subplot with a romance? Okay, so I would just come in and I would write down anything else that I know needs to happen in this story. So for Disappearance of Vanessa Shaw, it might be, okay, I know that I want to have some encounters where they think it might be Vanessa's ghost. I also want to have them following clues to try to figure out what happened to Vanessa. I don't have to get super specific about each of those things. I just need to go ahead and write them down and let my subconscious mind go ahead and be working on these story problems. For something like a Mirror of Shadows, I know that I want to have different characters have different abilities, powerful abilities, right? And I want them to all be different. So something I know that I'm going to need to do is to showcase those characters, introduce those characters, and that's most likely to happen here in this sort of fun and games sort of area of Act 2. Then we have some other things that I need to establish her normal life before she goes into the mirror, because we need to see her character arc, right? So we need to see who she is at the beginning of the story versus who she becomes by the end of it. So I need to show her normal life before the mirror. I always have to have a romance in my books. So it's just a necessity, even if it's not a romance novel, there's always got to be a romance subplot. So I know I want a romance. Maybe I don't have any idea yet what I want it to be, but maybe I know kind of the trope is that I'd like to play around with an enemies to lovers romance in this one. So I might just start writing down all these things that I already know about the character. Like, I know I want to give her an ally inside the mirror. I know that I want some battle scenes. Maybe I have an idea for a potion shop inside the mirror. And I could just write down all those things that I know so far. And when I start combining this idea with this, maybe I have some idea of where these things are going to come into the story. So for example, I might say here, I know that I need her normal life, and I need to introduce the antagonist that's going to send her through the mirror, right? And maybe I also want to sort of show her magic a little bit. These aren't specific scenes. They're just things I know I want to happen in the story. Then I might say, okay, well, here in the new world, so I need to introduce the love interest. Then I need to introduce the new character. So that's like the people. And maybe I could make a note to say I want to showcase their powers. If you were writing, let's say, a space opera or something like that, you might have the beginning, genre-wise, it's going to be like them loading up the ship and heading on a new adventure or something. And then something goes wrong in Act 1 that puts them into the story, right? It puts them into the premise. Maybe it's that they discover a new land, or maybe they get into some kind of meteor shower and their ship gets messed up and they have to land on this foreign planet. That would be the act one. It's like, what's the first big problem that comes up for these characters? And then how do we introduce the new world that they're put into? It could be actually literally a new world, like it will be with my shadow story. Or it could be a new world in that, okay, I met this guy, I had sworn off love, he kissed me, or I just found out he's my new boss, boom. Now what is the new world? Now I have to work this job where there's all this tension between us. That's all the stuff that goes in here. So just start brainstorming bullet points of scenes that you could see happening between your characters or as they find their bearings here. And then boom, once we get to this midpoint, we need another shift. So we have our first shift here at the end of Act 1. We need another shift here at the end of Act 2, where we say everything changes, right? So maybe in your space, like alien invasion story or whatever it might be, your sci-fi story, maybe everything changes is something you could brainstorm, like what's another conflict that could come up, that they thought they were alone on this planet, but in the midpoint, they realized that they actually landed on a planet they're familiar with that has an entire race of people that hate humans. Like there could be anything there, but like something's got to happen at this midpoint that changes everything. And even as I'm talking through it, let's say in this new world, everyone says there's no way out of the mirror, but maybe at the midpoint, she discovers, instead of being challenged to a duel, maybe she discovers that there's a way out. That if she were to cast this spell on midnight at the such and such whatever, she could actually break the mirror spell. And she finds this this book that explains what she needs to do. But there's a conflict as to why she can't do it. So then I would want to explore that conflict here in the third part. And that's going to lead me down to the second doorway, where let's say she's getting ready to cast this spell, but someone does something terrible and they like ruin the one piece of the spell, like the crystal gets broken and now she can't cast the spell anymore. So all her hopes are dashed. And now we've got her with a race against time to try to repair the crystal before the sun sets on the third day. Like, I don't know, I'm just throwing stuff out there, but you would just think through what are the major twists and turns that could happen. And of course, it really greatly depends on what genre you're writing as to what type of twist and turn these moments in your story are going to be. Is it going to be romance? Then each one of these little points needs to have to do with your romance. The first time they kiss, the first time they have sex, when they break up, when they get back together. Like it could be that simple, right? If it's science fiction story, it's their first doorway, their first sense of real trouble, then the exploration, then another big conflict comes along, then the final big conflict comes along that they have to face and overcome in this last part, like their final plan, their final hope of seeing it all through. So think about your genre and just start exploring. Once you have as much of this down as you can, I highly recommend taking a moment and doing a bit of a mind map with each of the pieces that you have in place. Because at this point, you might have lots of little dots filled in, but they might not be specific and they might not be fleshed out. Now, for some people, as I said in the intro, you don't need to flesh this out. Maybe this is more than enough and you just have a note card that has some bullet points on it and you just start writing and you're all good to go. Maybe you spend a little bit of time with your world building like we did last week's video. And then you just are ready to start writing for Nano. For other people, you might want to go ahead and have this all filled out on note cards the way that I do. So it's really up to you how deep you want to go in this process. And I would really highly encourage you to use your intuition with that. That if you think, okay, do I feel excited and ready to write? Or do I want to figure out a little bit more of this story? And just go to the point where it continues to feel good to you. Because for some of us, you're just going to discover these pieces in the writing. But let me keep going for those of you that want to keep going. So I would continue to mind map. So then we're going to break it down. Remember how I said that trip to New York City, right? I don't have to, like, these are my places I'm going to spend the night along the way. But now I'm going to try to actually figure out what's my route for day one of this trip. So I might come in here and let me think how best to really do this. Like I might come up here and I might just put Act 1, And then I'll say something like, the first thing that happens is she's stealing a crystal. And that's the first thing we see from the character, is she's stealing a crystal. And I know that somehow I want to get her to this Act 1 climax, or the first doorway of being pushed into the mirror. But I have to figure out all the things that happen in between. And I have a few ideas about her normal life and the antagonist and showing her magic. So I'm going to go ahead and pull those out in little pieces over here. So I might say, okay, who's the antagonist? This might not actually even be the right word for her, because we're not going to see her in the mirror world, but she's kind of the catalyst person. Who's the girl that pushes her through the mirror, right? Who is that? Then I might have a question, and I can circle that over here. And then I might have a question over here of normal life. And then I put over here MC's magic. So these are all the little pieces that I pulled from here. And now I'm just putting them out on a mind map sort of page. And then I can just start brainstorming. And it, like I said, it doesn't have to be attached to any idea. Just open your mind up and say, what would be kind of fun for her magic? What kind of magic do I want her to have? Well, I know she's a thief. So let's say she can go invisible. She can pick locks. She can, she has infinite pockets. That would be kind of cool. And I could just start writing down different forms of her magic. What is her normal life? Okay, so she's an orphan. She lives at a Ruby Prima's house. And I could just start writing down the things I know about her normal life. What do I know about this antagonist that pushes her through the mirror? What would be some fun things? And as I go, I can just start circling the ideas that I like best. Then I can start thinking, okay, with all of these pieces in place, how do I start telling this as a story? And this is where we're either going to come to my working outline sheet, or you're going to start actually giving yourself bullet points, right? So again, I'm just using these big note cards because I like them. And you could brainstorm scenes here too. So you could say, okay, here's her normal life. Let's talk about a scene that would happen in her normal, showing her normal life. And you could write out what happens in this scene. What's a scene where we see her using her magic? Well, the thief scene is where we're going to see her using her magic for the first time. But where does she encounter the antagonist? And start thinking of these things that you already had in bullet points as scenes. Now we're going to go in here and we're going to make a little Act 1 or Part 1 note card. And we can start just doing simple scene bullet points. And sometimes the way that I like to do this is literally just stepping my mind through the story. Now, for those of you that are familiar with 3-act structure or different plotting methods that have beats, this is where you're going to start to work through the beats of your story, going from the beginning of Act 1 to the climax of Act 1. Now, if you wanted some books to read up on, Jessica Brody has a book based on Blake Snyder's screenwriting book called Save the Cat. And this is called Save the Cat Writes a Novel. And she specifically goes through different story beats that you have in a lot of stories. So you've got the opening image, the setup, the theme, the catalyst, the debate, the break into two, the fun and games, and so on. And so this will walk you through it. If you understand those beats, you can use her beats. There's also, if you're writing a romance, Gwen Hayes has a book called Romancing the Beat. I will link all that below. I tend to follow just a typical hero's journey, or I'm studying more on the heroine's journey as well, in a 3-act structure, which, like I said, I'm now calling a 4-part structure. And that's what I've walked you through in your Preptober planner. And again, you can get this for free. Just sign up for my newsletter list down below, and I will send you a link to my resource library where you can download it. But I will start with, okay, what's the hook of the story? What's that opening scene? And I will write out everything I figured out in my brainstorming. And then I might come down here and say, this is the Act 1 climax where she gets pushed through the mirror, right? And then I'll start either way. I can back up, what happens right before she gets pushed in the mirror, and I can reverse engineer some of this stuff. And I can also work my way forward. I can also work in any of the things that I saw here that I know are scenes that I want to get introduced in this part. So at some point we need to meet this antagonist and she needs to push her through the mirror, but maybe we just see the antagonist here. Antagonist or catalyst, whatever you want to call it, confronts her at the Ruby house. And so I can write down anything I know about that scene. And then at the climax of that scene, she pushes her through the mirror. At the hook, we have her in a warehouse stealing a crystal. So what might happen next? Okay, once I just literally will walk myself through the story of like, what's the next logical thing that might happen? She's stolen the crystal. Where does she take it? If she's stolen it for the order, she's going to take it back to her handler or whatever, whoever requested the crystal. So I might have a scene there where she takes it back. Then I might have her go to high school. Like maybe this is me showing her normal life. Remember, I had this part where I was like, I got to show her normal life. So maybe she spent her whole night and morning working on this crystal, and now she has to go to high school and pretend to be just a normal girl. Or maybe I'm going to put her in college, and I can start brainstorming that college scene where I show her normal life. And then I can just try to connect the dots based on how long I want this act to be. And so I might say like, okay, we've got the antagonist that confronts her at the Ruby house. What else could happen in between this that could set things up for what's happening later in my story? And I would just continue to look at those beats. If I get stuck here and I'm not sure what happens in the middle, then I'm going to come to these actual story beats and I'm going to start filling them out. So for example, main character at the beginning, this is going to be my hook. Their normal world, this will be the scene of her at college. And then opening scene, how does it hook the reader in? So actually, this is not the hook. When I say main character at the beginning, I mean like what's her emotional state at the beginning. So from this character in my mirror story, it's very much like her emotional state is that she's trapped here, that she doesn't have any independence, that she's going to be basically a workhorse for the Order of Shadows her whole life, but she never is going to be let into the order. And so she's feeling hopeless. She feels trapped. She feels like she has no control or agency in her life. Then I show her normal world where that emotional side of her is actually shown in scenes. Then the hook is that she's going to steal this crystal, right? So I can write everything that I know about that. But then the dramatic question of this story is what? Now, because she's going to get moved and pushed into this mirror, I need to think about what's happening later in the story. So the dramatic question might be something like, will she ever break free of the order or the control that other people have on her? Will she ever be strong enough to break free of other people's control? How does she feel about the conflict or the disturbance at first? So the disturbance is the stealing of this crystal and maybe, what's going on here. That's usually the conflict or the disturbance going on here. Or I could say, how does she feel about this idea that she's not free? And I can just riff on that a little bit. The inciting incident is something that typically happens, in a bit into the story, but it can also be something that happens before the story. So for example, in Disappearance of Vanessa Shaw, the inciting incident is Vanessa's disappearance, which happens in the prologue. But sometimes the inciting incident doesn't happen until later in the story, as is the case here. The inciting incident is that she's going to be, all of this inciting incident and key event all happen kind of together where she's going to get pushed into the mirror. And I will sort of caveat this by saying I'm writing this book as a serial. So I will actually go through a slightly different plotting process because this is going to be broken into pieces. And I won't structure it exactly like I would a novel. So if you're interested in seeing how I'm going to structure this serialized story, let me know and I will do that. But right now we're kind of focusing on novels. But basically that process is what I will go through with every single act. So I will take the overview of the story and any scenes I could imagine there. And I will go through Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, Act 4, and I will just step through, okay, now that we're in Act 2 and she's in this mirror world, what are the scenes? What needs to happen next to get her to this point where she discovers in the library a way to escape from this mirror? And I already know quite a bit about her reaction to getting into the mirror and what all is going to happen here. In The Disappearance of Vanessa Shaw, the first doorway is that they also get stuck or trapped on this river and in this cabin, and they think the killer is there and they're all in danger. Potentially Vanessa's ghost as well is part of the story. So all of this that happens at the first part of Act 2 is a reaction to this first doorway. And so this for me tends to be an easy place to write, but then sometimes I get stuck trying to figure out what else happens leading to this way. And so I will just follow that same process of writing out a bunch of bullet points. You can start with maybe like 8 scenes. Let's say we're going to start with 8 to 10 scenes per act or per part, and just start reverse engineering and filling in the blanks of anything you see so far, and get as specific as you can, but don't worry if you can't get too specific. Then come into my plotting sheets here. I'm not going to walk you through all of this, but if you would like to know a little bit more about these beats, then I will also link my How to Plot a Novel series. I will be redoing that entire series in 2024, which I know many of you have requested. So there will be more coming up on the plotting part, but I do kind of walk you through some of these questions, like how do these, like what challenges come up next? How do these challenges make her grow or see the world differently? What happens at the midpoint? What happens at the mirror moment? And if you watch that series on plotting, you will see what I'm talking about with the mirror moment. Another thing that I do like to do, speaking of the mirror moment, when I'm brainstorming my plot, is I will create this little triangle here where I say, who is my character at the beginning of this story? And this is sort of a character arc thing, which we'll get into more later. Who is she at the beginning of this story? And then who does she need to become in order to fulfill the end of this story question, right? In a romance, it's like, how does this girl who has her heart closed off from love come to fall in love and truly give herself to this person, right? Something along those lines. There's always that character arc. Now, you might be writing like a detective mystery where there's not much of a character arc, so you may not need this, but this can be another tool where you say, here's where they are at the beginning, here's who they become at the end. And then we take a look at the middle of the book where James Scott Bell says there is usually a mirror moment, which is a moment of like, who have I become? I must change or I'm going to die. It can also be a moment of the odds against me are too great, which if I stuck with the idea of her being challenged to a duel in my mirror story, she might be like, the odds against me are too great. I'm probably going to die here, but I'm going to go down fighting. And then throughout the rest of the course of the book, she becomes so strong that she finds a way out. So sometimes figuring out your character's arc can also make you think, oh, I need a scene where she learns this new type of magic. So where's that going to go? And then you can go back to your little storyline here and say, okay, this is where her magic is going to grow a little bit. I know this looks a little bit chaotic, but for me, the back and forth of what can I figure out along the way, starting with the big sort of tent poles of the story, the things that hold up the story, the biggest turning points of the story emotionally and, plot wise. Can I figure those out? And then can I reverse engineer and kind of work my way backward and forward using any scenes that I knew or anything I know I want to happen. So for example, a subplot in this story is going to be a romance. So I can separately go out here and create another mind map to say, who is this romance going to be? Here's the one I was using. Who is this romance going to be? I could start a whole new mind map here and say romance. And I could say, okay, I want it to be enemies to lovers, but this, but this, but this. And I can start mind mapping and coming up with different scenes that might be possibilities. And the more I can open my mind instead of feeling like I have to have it figured out perfectly right from the start, the better off it's going to be. And sometimes if you're following a really strict structure, like a romance novel sometimes have pretty strict structure in terms of the different things that readers are expecting, especially if you're following certain tropes, that it might be easier to find your way to these scenes. With some things like literary fiction or more complex like multiple POV novels, you might not have as easy of a time figuring out each individual beat. So that's why I've given you this sort of roadmap to figuring out the beats. And then understand that as you're writing, you just need to be thinking, what's the next logical thing that could happen that could impact this story? And how would my character, knowing what I know about them, react or respond? What would be the next thing they would do? And just walk your way through the story like that. I hope this has been helpful. I know this, again, is a longer video, but by the time I typically am ready to write, I will have all of these things figured out for myself. Now you can see kind of, my desk is chaos here as well. But for like the disappearance of Vanessa Shaw, for example, I will have this is Act 1. And I will have it mapped out according to the plot, which chapter, what's happening in the scene, What's the conflict of this scene? What's the purpose of this scene, like the goal of this scene? And then how many words did it take me to write that? And this type of thing really helps me in terms of keeping on track. Now, I don't always know this before I start writing. I'll just have pieces of it, just like we did in that note card. And then I will gradually fill it out as I go, because as you write, you're going to start having light bulb moments and ideas. Now, we will have a video later about what happens if you get stuck, that you've written the first act, but now you can't figure out what happens in act 2, but hopefully some of this will help you. Another way that I like to organize my notes, because I'm very much a paper plotter kind of person, is I will either take my note cards and put them on, just take like a little hole punch, and I will punch them and put them on one of these like book rings that you can get on Amazon, just like this, to keep them all in order. Or I also have this cool little thing that I've been using lately where you can slip them into sleeves and then you can just kind of page through it like a book. And I have been enjoying this because I get a bigger view than just one note card at a time. But on my note cards, I like to put the basic premise of the scene, my character's goal in the scene, the conflict of the scene, and the outcome. How does it turn out? And then any notes that I might have about that scene. And the way this helps me is, if I can identify what my character wants to achieve in this scene and what their conflict is going to be, and then how that conflict leads to an outcome they didn't expect, I can usually say, okay, so now that she's realizing how alone she is and how bad she feels, what would she do next? Maybe she runs off to her room and she has a good cry, or something like that. Or maybe she runs to a friend. And that's where the stuff like the mind mapping or sitting down with a friend and saying, what could happen next? Here's what I've got so far in the story, and just start bouncing ideas off each other. Well, what if she did this? What if she did this? What if she did this? And sometimes that can help me when I'm feeling stuck, is I'll say, here's the outcome of this scene and here's what's happened so far. And then I'll just jot down a list of, like, set a timer for 10 minutes and jot down a list of what's 10 more things that could happen. And keep in mind, what's the next big story point that happens? So like at some point they're going to have a storm and they're going to get trapped here, or at some point she's going to get pushed through this mirror. So what needs to happen before that? And in the context of that, what are 10 things that could potentially happen? And eventually you just make a choice and you write it, and it feels right or it doesn't. And if it doesn't feel right, you write something different. And that is the process of being a writer. And I think sometimes where people get really stuck is that they feel like it has to be right or perfect the very first time you do it. But the truth is, you have all these pieces of paper, all these chances, as much as you want to be able to take it and try new things and brainstorm new scenes. But I know that for NaNoWriMo specifically, we really want to try to have as much of it figured out as we individually need in order to keep moving forward. So I do have lots of resources in this Preptober planner for you to continue to expand on what we've done today. So you've got this full 4-page outline that will walk you all the way through to the very climax of the story. And it even is going to inform your world building as well as your character arc. Then I also have an explanation on how to then take that and write scene by scene. And I explained to you how I created these scene cards and this brainstorming scene process to reflect on what just happened, determine how to best transition from this scene to this scene, and it walks you through these steps. I do also have a series here on YouTube about how to write your book from scenes. So I will link all of that for you below if you just want to keep watching. And that is all of the sort of brainstorming stuff that I have for you. And I hope that this is super helpful. Please let me know in the comments if there's anything that you want me to expand on or that doesn't work for you, or a place that you've tried all these steps and you're still getting stuck. Let me know, and I am here to help as much as I can. But eventually there comes a point where you just have to try and be willing for it to not be the right thing, and then try something different, and then try something different, and just never give up. Okay, we did it. That's it for our NaNoWriMo outlining video, our Preptober outlining video. I hope this was helpful. I hope something here really resonated with you. I love talking about plotting because it is such a great tool for keeping your story cohesive, for making sure that your story and your characters are telling the story that you want. They have the theme and the meanings that you wanted to put into it. And it's also something that you can always turn to when you feel like you're stuck. But like I said, do it your way. So let me know in the comments, are you a plotter? Are you a pantser traditionally and you're just watching this video looking for a little bit of ideas, or are you still searching for your perfect process? Let me know in the comments. Please subscribe to this video, share it with friends if you know of anybody that is still looking to get ready for Preptober, and join us for NaNoWriMo. And of course, go and download your Preptober planner down below. You just have to sign up for my newsletter. You'll get an email first that will ask you to confirm your subscription. When you do that, you'll get another email in just a few minutes that will have a link to my entire resource library where I've got world building information, Preptober planners, how to plot a novel, how to edit your novel, how to write a series, tons and tons of great free, totally free resources there for you. And all you have to do is sign up for my list. So hope you enjoyed this. I will have a new video coming out talking about pacing and subplots soon. So just stay tuned. I will see you in that next video. Bye.